Maayong adlaw, and this is our second lecture for workshop 1. In our earlier discussion, we'll learn that humanity strive to find something so that somehow it can cement his identity. And cementing his own identity is by learning his greatest achievements that were created from um, the very large timeline of human civilization. And as we progress with our discussion, as we learn to study the art in two perspectives, we in our previous and perhaps in your previous classes, you already learned the formal approach to study art, which is studying the elements and for example, in music, you study the melody of it, or in you do painting, you study the color mixing, or in literary or in literature, you learned to um, compose poetry, and by composing, you have to consider how to measure precisely the stanzas or the meter. So, um, and these are the elements or the basic or the intrinsic part of the arts. However, there are also the other part which is more culture bound, in which will be the focus of our discussion in the part 2 of our first lecture. So when we study art and humanities, um, we can right away say that the approaches are synchronic and diachronic. Synchronic, the formal, classical form, and diachronic, studying, relating this articulation to a certain culture that produces it. In studying the art and the humanities, and in our earlier discussion, we learned that we wanted to study the humanities so we can have the grasp of man's greatest achievements. In studying this, there are already established set approaches, and these approaches are synchronic, where the classical and formal, and on the other hand, the diachronic, where the study of art is related to culture. Humanities and art and relating this to culture are the three interrelated concepts. As man seeks for answer to his questions, it resulted in a lot of discoveries, not only satisfying to his desire for aesthetics, but invented ways to make his life comfortable. This knowledge allowed the advancement of science and the art later on, and especially during the classical period of the Greek civilization. Art making undergoes a process. Like any processes, it will begin to something sketchy, then slowly progresses until it reaches completion. It can be painting, a poem, or a classical ballet recital. Therefore, art, being a process that man engages in, anchors to an environment that influences its shaping. This environment is called culture. Everything palpable and tangible man does on a certain space-time mirrors his culture. Art, being man's expressions, manifests his culture. This culture, similar to signs and expressions, are shared, so it will live and become their shared identity or his shared identity. For example, the Bagobo Tagabawa share the same expression within their community, separate from the Subanan of Zamboanga Peninsula or the Mangyan in Mindoro. When we study symbols, these are gestures, objects or images, words, and many others, languages that denote a shared meanings. They are an outer layers of palpable ideas valued by culture, and it is necessary because it glued culture. Examples of symbols that is unique to Filipino, for example, is the in culinary is the adobo, or the spices that is being shared by Asians but is absent in many Scandinavian cultures, or in the um, places in the higher latitude, precisely because these spices are abundant to the tropical places but are scarce um, to colder climate. That's why the European dislikes our spices or the smells of it. But Asians, however, or on the other hand, love so much, especially the Indian, and putting so much spices in their foods. When we say semiotics, it refers to the study of symbols. In the artists use signs and symbols to encode their works, which a culture decodes. The dance, the music, literature, or it could be a chant, or even a short story, or sugilanon o bulanon, the media in any form, and the visual art all embody symbols, the meaning of which are comprehensible to culture deciphering this. So that the Epic of Gilgamesh um, stays for century perhaps in a culture isolated in between two rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, but at the same time brought by people who migrated to other places later on, and becomes a footprint of many stories, especially in the Eastern, uh, which codified later on in the Old Testament of the Jewish people, and also reaches to our shores because in many communities in the hinterlands, or those who are living in the higher regions of Mindanao, for example, similar lore exists in many cultural communities. For example, in the Manobo. In its neighboring Mamanwa, and a lot of culture in the Philippines, even in the Cordilleras. Later on, as I've mentioned, as we progress, as civilization progressed and accumulated tons of knowledge, the Greek categorizes this as the refine their approach to study art. And when we categorize art, it depends on how it is perceived. And the perception varies, no, from how the Chinese perceives their writing to the Indian or to the Egyptian hieroglyphs or to our sulat. And this was nurtured in the West, no, at the height of the Greek civilization, that they canonized this categorizing of arts. And later on, from the medieval period until the Renaissance, it culminates in the Renaissance, where categories become obvious and widely used in the universities in Europe, in America, towards 18th However, this doesn't mean that the West is superior over others in terms of the degree of artistic achievements. If you visited the Southeast Asian countries, for example, you've been um, to Thailand, to the Ayutthaya, where the seat of their Siam kingdom, and in Angkor Wat, this civilization achieved superior knowledge of building monuments. The Chinese civilization for millennia built this Great Wall, and this was very successful in their desire to defend and to sustain their civilization against invaders. And in Europe, for example, the Greek built theater, built market, public place, and polis from the Assyrian, you know, of their neighboring civilization. The Greek, they built the pyramids, and people in the Pacific Island, they carve human-like figures. So this can become their identity. But despite these differences, they produce arts that has similar features, and these similarities facilitate us to classify it into genres. So when we studied using the formal approach of learning all these things, it would be easier for us to right away identify because of this categorization. And the following are the 7 categories of arts. These are architecture, the visual arts, includes sculpture and painting, music, literature, theater, dance, and cinema. Forms that use similar mediums can be clustered into their own sets. Architecture, painting, and sculpture form the spatial arts because these are created in one space. Music and literature form the temporal arts. It exists on our consciousness, subconscious. The combining this, space and time, media form the combined arts we call theater, dance, and cinema. This categorizing may not be applicable in many Asian creative expressions, including the Philippines. It is because our indigenous creative expressions overlap in many senses, making it near impossible to classify using the Western categorization of or nomenclature, they call it. In most cases, these creations combine into an integrated form, so they overlap. For example, when we talk of the book Logan of the Subanen, it integrates music, it integrates chants with capture the spirituality, the presence of their divine, and and the communal use of colors through as articulated in their costumes and in their props. And the food that they prepared can already says a lot of that culture when it comes to the culinary. So in opposition, arts are produced in urban centers, and these are usually followed to the categorization. However, those that are produced in the rural area or in the indigenous communities whose expressions are being preserved, if you call it a term, no, in referring to their millennia of creative expression. This will not or might not fit to the seven categorization of the arts. However, in our next lecture, which focus on the Philippine arts, we will try to look into the diachronic, approach of studying and understanding these uh, creative expressions of these indigenous communities. And accordingly, there are functions of art. And art functions differently depending on the condition that morph its shaping. With these differences, art forms will also vary across cultures. This being parts of our lives cascaded and influences not only to a certain community and the nation in general. The following is cited from the book of Dr. Fernandez. Psychological functions. Its subliminal presence affects us without being aware of it. Art surrounds us, but we do not seem to notice it. Around us, colors integrate shapes harmoniously, come into place, and designs balance to give us a sense of harmony, of being one of our bigger world, giving us a feeling of peace. The art of arranging spaces has enhanced a living. If you try to look at the how cities was built during the time of the Sumerian civilization, which becomes the blueprint of urban setting in the succeeding civilization. However, it was further developed and enhanced for comfortability and aesthetics, of course. And feng shui is also very famous to the Chinese when it comes to um, the use of space, no, in a living space. In the West, the ancient Greek measured this harmony through a dictum that says a sound mind in a healthy body. So the highly symmetrical art that they created explained this philosophy, so that the after the battle at Marathon, the Athenian and many Greek states at that time not only learn or actively involve themselves in the athletics, but also in politics, in public discourse, in democracy, to further their learning. So they crave for more answers to questions facilitated by their philosophers and mathematicians, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, and then a lot of personality in Greek um, history. And thus, the refinement of this study of art uh, was credited so much to the Greek. The personal functions, art offers the man the experience of beauty. So even from the time immemorial when people still living in the cave, they already started to explore, find something from um, portable arts, they call it, to decorate themselves. So they make use of stones and maybe seeds of this plant and put this together to form a jewelry, something they can adorn, do rituals. And this experience of beauty enhances their well being. Man experiences art through his interaction with the visible, and these palpable manifestations of creation enable man to appreciate art and experience beauty, balance, and a strong sense of the world around him. So, the social functions, art is integrative rather than defensive. Art integrates people in the communities. The cohesion brings out an identity. An identity defines culture. Culture defines nation. A strong integrated nation of people sharing the same aspiration keeps intact. A strong nation defends culture from disintegrating. And this happens everywhere. For example, if you try to study the history of the city-states in Mesopotamia, in the city of Sumer. Um, for so long, they've been subject to invasion by different warring city-states and nomads people. However, the community is so integrated that whenever they were battle came in, they will fortify their wall, and they devise a military plan. So they will assure the winning of that battle, and therefore um, allowing the culture from disintegrating. In studying art and the humanities, art being the process that man engages in anchors to an environment that influences its shaping, and this environment we call culture. So this encompasses everything. In studying the arts and humanities, when we talk about art, it is a process that man engages in, and it anchors into a certain environment. And this environment somehow influences the shaping of this uh, communities, and these communities becomes culture. When we say an environment that influences the shaping of the consciousness of these communities, for example, the people in the Sulu archipelago for centuries mastered the art of making boats, because that is necessitates to the very survival of that community. And a lot of people from the hinterlands and from the jungles learn how to put or build houses up in the trees, and that necessitates because the environment dictates them to build houses high in the trees to avoid um, voracious animals and other maybe their enemies, and communities in Harappa and in Sumerian, for example, they build their houses in mud, and because soil is a very good insulator for heat, no. And if you try to look at some of the communities in the coastal area, most of the houses are built in they call it in a hut, no? Call it the bahay kobo, and that is precisely the reason why it is designed to build that way. So the natural ventilation, or the incoming and in and out of the wind, can cool the interior of the bahay kobo. So we try to look at our houses now in the urban cities in Mindanao and the Philippines. Most of the houses are bungalow type, and or a mansion or a villa. And if you try to get into this house, it requires a lot of air conditioning to cool down, unlike the bahay kubo counterpart, which does not require actually electricity to run to become efficient. So you see why certain Filipino consciousness prefer to build this type of houses, because perhaps they had this experience when they went abroad, and when we go to the US, they learn that, oh, their houses looks like this, and after going back to the country, they copy that kind of architecture. Ends our lecture B for our workshop 1. We have one more workshop with which focus one more lecture which focus on the arts in the Philippines. I'll see you on my next lecture. Thank you very much for listening. Maayong adlaw sa tanan.